Reading Rainbow of Death. We're interviewing Tom Breen. Unless there's technical difficulties.
Unless there's technical difficulties.
Unless there's technical difficulties.
Then we'll just play an old episode of Frasier or something.
Take a look. It's in our book. A reading rainbow.
All right, joining us today on the Reading Rainbow of Death is half of the Orford Parish Small Press team. He's author of Orford Parish Murder Houses. He has a story in Orford Parish's Old Gory, two tales of flag horror, and a wonderful tale in the Orford Parish book, 3 Moves of Doom, with Matthew Bartlett and Joseph Pastula. You're a good one to ask because I've said his name a few times and I think I've ruined it every time. Is it Joseph Pastula?
Yeah, you got it. That's right.
Okay. Well, then I feel less bad about ruining it. Thank you for being on the show today, Tom.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Oh, not a problem. Jonathan Rabb was the one who told me to read Orford Parish. He got me on almost all of the indie horror that I've been reading, and you were you were a bit further down the line before I finally got yours, and Orford Parish Murder Houses was the first thing I read of yours, and I fell in love with it. It is amazing. I'll just start off with that before we get going. It's written like a visitor's guide to Orford Parish and kind of a where to stop on your trip through at all the murder houses and all the grisly murders that have happened there, and it is probably one of the most entertaining books I've read out of all the indie horror I've been reading. So before we get going with the interview, I just wanted to make sure I told you that.
I appreciate that, and I have not paid you for that endorsement at all. That's very nice to hear. Thank you very much.
And it runs through the 3 Moves of Doom too, like attention to small detail, especially in murder houses and 3 Moves of Doom. In 3 Moves of Doom, it's wrestling stories, and you have the old wrestling advertisements and the advertisements you'd find in old wrestling magazines, just kind of here and there sprinkled throughout. In murder houses, you have at the end of the story explaining the grisly murder, you have the closest diner and where to get a good milkshake. It's those little things that I think make your books fantastic. So I will throw that out there as well.
Thank you very much.
Pretty much what I try to do on here is just let you guys give your take on why you do what you do and why it is people should be reading your books, and said better than I would. So the same question I ask everyone else, and you get the second added question since you have your own small press, is what is it attracts you to writing horror, and what is it that made you want to go the self-published or small press, running your own small press route?
All right. Well, what makes me want to write horror? I've always been kind of morbid and like I was a weird kid, you know. I was thinking about this the other day. We were talking at work about who our first celebrity crushes were when we were kids. Yep. And mine was Heather Langenkamp from Nightmare on Elm Street.
Nice.
Yeah, and people were like, well, how old were you when you... And I guess I was like 7 when I saw that movie. And I always liked horror. I was always drawn to horror. And then as I got older, like I became aware that it had this stigma attached to it. And people didn't take it seriously. And so I tried to, you know, make myself smarter or look smarter and think, oh yeah, I'm not going to read horror. I'm going to read James Joyce or whatever. And I never liked it. So I was always kind of like gravitating back to horror just because I think it answers questions that other types of fiction don't really address.
Yeah.
And as for why I wanted to start writing it, I used to work as a reporter. I worked for small town newspapers, and I worked for the Associated Press. And I always liked the format of journalistic writing, but I always thought how much better the stories would be if I could just make things up. I did not make things up. I want to stress. But stories that are, just like a couple tweaks. You can think like, this story would be so much better if this guy had, whatever, like if this guy had been a clown or something, whatever the case may be. And that's kind of how the style of murder houses and things developed. It's like, I like to take things that are sort of real world, like you'd encounter like a boring travel guide in a small town, and then make it about like grisly murders or something.
Yeah, well, and you do a fantastic job at it.
Well, I appreciate that. So I think it was more just a lifelong fixation on horror, and then kind of boredom at my day job and thinking, how could I make this a little more interesting? And usually the answer is throw a murder in there, then it gets a little more interesting.
That always spices things up.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, a ghost, a murder, sometimes both. In terms of the self-publishing, small press, DIY thing, in addition to being into horror, since I was a kid, I got into punk rock when I was about 13 years old, and there was a big punk scene where I grew up in Connecticut, and everybody, like people formed their own bands and made their own records and did their own radio shows and did their own fanzines, and it was just sort of nobody waited for permission to do the things they wanted to do, and that was the attitude I've taken forward with me ever since. And
so it didn't start from, because I've heard a couple people just say frustration. What I do isn't always quickly sellable. People don't see it as like, ooh, I can sell this when you're doing indie horror
right.
Always. And so some people are like, I have frustration. I wanted it out there, so I put it out. And so yours was just more, and I kind of knew that. You've been kind enough to recommend some punk bands to me, so I kind of knew you were from that vein. So that's just did you ever think about doing the other way, or was it just like that's the attitude you have always, just I'll do it?
It's kind of always the attitude I had when you mentioned Joe Pastula and I. He was also, we did a fanzine together when we were teenagers in the punk scene, and when we started talking about, hey, why don't we put out stories that we like, it was never a question of why don't we pitch stories or why don't we see if someone will publish the stories. Once you look into print on demand technology and how easy it is to make a decent looking book now, we just thought, this is great. This is like making records, in the old days. Like, why don't we just do it? And since then, I've submitted, and I've had stories published in anthologies and things, and that's fun and that's nice. But it's still, it's more satisfying to me to kind of start at the beginning with writing and then go all through the editing and hiring an artist and getting everything together, copy editing and proofreading, and then you're responsible for selling it, just like selling 12-inch records, at a show or something. And so to me, I like doing that. And I know that it has sort of a bad reputation. People, for whatever reason, in the horror community kind of look down on DIY publishing. But that also kind of, that's sort of an attraction to me too. I kind of like being thought of as a dirtbag. I like professional wrestling and punk rock and horror. I'm not trying to impress anyone.
Like that was, I kind of talked to, when I interviewed Rab, we had a bit on that. That was, I've got to meet a lot of, at least your guys' group, I guess you would call it. I don't know if you think of yourselves as a group, but Rab and Bartlett and you and Thompson and a lot of the names that pop up around the books that you guys are in. And I've got to meet a lot of you guys, and I kind of grew up in the sticks, so like just mainstream writing in general, I don't know a lot of names. Not a lot of things trickle through to me. So finding you guys and Rab, and he kind of showed me this little scene. It's always been fun comparing it to the music, because I've always been into music. So you got a music scene, you have your writing scene, your this scene. And that was what I found the most shocking, was that there's this kind of nose in the air at self-publishing. And it really shocked me, like, that it even like, I get it in literary fiction where there's a bit more pretense anyways, but that it trickles down into horror, because that was always kind of just, I love it, it's not an insult to it, but it's always just kind of a trash genre anyways, like like punk. It's equivalent to the punk scene of old, where it's just people doing stuff to do stuff. It's gonna offend, it's gonna ruffle feathers, and there's a lot of times I think horror has some of the best comedy in it, even when it's not funny at all.
Yep.
Just because it has a very sarcastic tone to it. And so I was shocked when I didn't mean to cut you off. I was shocked when I found that people kind of stick their noses in the air at that. And it always makes me laugh hearing guys like you when you're like, well, I kind of like that too. Fuck them.
Yeah, I mean, I know that Jonathan Rabb has talked about this. You know, he gets agitated when people say, oh, I don't write horror fiction, I write weird fiction. Like, there's this, not everyone who says that means it that way, but there's this attempt to kind of like, oh, we want to separate ourselves from the horror label because it is trashy, because people think of like werewolves and Stephen King and slasher movies. And I'm fine with that. Like, I don't, like if I cared about being sort of getting mainstream acceptance or literary acceptance, I wouldn't be doing the stuff I'm doing. I just like what I'm doing and want to keep doing it. And this is, it's now easier than ever to kind of be your own publishing company, just like you could be your own record label now. But yeah, it is funny to encounter like people's book sales are like in the hundreds, and like everyone's like, you go to horror conventions, like everyone's wearing like a black t-shirt or something, and it's like, and still you encounter, like, you get this high hat from people and you think, who are you kidding?
Yeah. So, but in Orford Parish, your publishing house, I don't know what you call them, small press, whatever you call it. I'm totally a noob at all this. You guys, the other thing that I don't know if I've actually told you or not, but Letters of Decline was one of the earlier books that I've read, and is still, I think, at the moment, one of my favorite short story books that I've kind of encountered all this since April. When Rab got a hold of me about a Bones song, and he was like, hey, I was like, I like to read, just don't pay me to use a song for a trailer, just send me a book or whatever. And he's like, you like to read all this. And so I started, and I think out of everything I've read, like when I start telling people about the indie horror that I've been reading, and where Letters of Decline is still usually the first, like, you want to get an idea of it, you want a fantastic example of it that's great all the way through, but not like a big novel or a huge anthology to sink it. Letters of Decline is always the first book I mention, is that will give you a taste of everything that's great that's going on. So also on that book, I wanted to bring that up because I think when I was talking about you on last show, I don't know that I mentioned that book. I think I just stuck to the stuff that you were in. But
I appreciate it. That to me, I think, is my favorite Orford Parish release so far, and I don't have a story in it, but I think every writer has a different style. And for people who don't know, it's a book about job interviews. Every story is about a job interview. And I think that the stories in that book all have like distinctive styles, and they mesh really well together. So I'm so glad to hear you say that, because I think that to me is like the one thing we've done so far that I feel like came out exactly the way we wanted it to.
Yeah, and that's not to discount any of you guys' other books. I've really enjoyed, I have 4. I've really enjoyed, I got Old Gory Orford Parish Murder House's 3 Moves of Doom in that one. I've enjoyed all 4 a lot. 3 Moves of Doom, your story in 3 Moves of Doom, I wanted to talk about that briefly, just to hear you talk about it. It's the 3 Moves of Doom, they're all wrestling stories. But yours, like, I don't watch wrestling anymore. I used to watch it. It was what we did when I was high school, like junior, senior age. We'd get the pay-per-views, get pizza. If I'd get beer, we'd get together and put each other in wrestling moves and hurt each other and that kind of stuff. And so that whole WWF, it was still WWF back then, and WCW, like, and that was in the Kane coming back from the dead, the Undertaker was throwing lightning era.
Yes.
Like when when Vince McMahon was like, I don't give a fuck what goes on. Just do some shit. Make it big and make it special effects. Yeah, I don't give a fuck. Whatever. And that is what your story in that book totally encapsulates that whole era for me wonderfully in a real horror story. So just if you can just talk about where that one came from for a second, I'd really like to hear.
Well, thank you, first of all. And that story, I've been off and on into wrestling my whole life. Like, kind of the same thing you're describing. My friends and I were really into that too, like the NWO era and Steve Austin and all that.
Yeah.
And then I just kind of stopped paying attention for a long time. And a couple of years ago, a friend said, "Hey, there's a wrestling show at this town hall in this rural town." And I was like, "Oh, all right, well, whatever." And since then, I've really gotten into indie wrestling. And there's this kind of like a subset of indie wrestling called deathmatch wrestling, where like guys, like they use like these horrifying weapons. I mean, they hit each other with those fluorescent light tubes, and they, you know, there's thumbtacks everywhere and baseball bats wrapped in barbed wire, and like it's just, I mean, wrestling it's obviously a performance. It's not like a competition, but like these guys really get hurt.
Yeah. This is like the ECW days.
Yes.
Kind of where the deathmatch.
Yeah. Yes. And there's still a couple companies that do it. There's one in southern Indiana called IWA Mid-South, and there's one in New Jersey called Combat Zone. And I've always been kind of like fascinated by that, but also like really scared of it too, because like it's one thing when you see people who know what they're doing and they have a wrestling match, but it's another thing when like you can't really predict what's going to happen when you throw a guy off a roof into the back of a pickup truck that's on fire, which has happened at the CZW show. So I kind of wanted to. I thought about people who do that year in and year out, and what that life must be like, and why they do it, and how like I also want to write a horror story that doesn't end with everyone dying, you know, like and almost like a story that's frightening, but at the same time has kind of like a awe-inspiring component to it. And I thought that deathmatch wrestling was a great setting for that, because it's frightening, but at the same time, at the end of it, you just think like, this is amazing that people do this.
Yeah, and your ending to that, it completely sells the story. Like when they start falling, it just goes crazy. It's that the whole ending to it I thought was fantastic. It was actually a book. It was the last one I got. Wrestling. I was bad about that. I've never been an anthology type person, or a, you know, like here's a book about this stuff. When it does that, I'm never one to like, if I don't have interest in what the stuff is, I'm just like, whatever. Letters of Decline was actually the one that changed my mind about that, because I seen Rab putting up that he had a book coming out in it, and I was like, job interviews, I don't know that I want to read that doesn't sell me. But I was like, screw it, Thompson's in it, and Rab's in it, and Bartlett's in it, and I had read its other stuff. I was like, I'll give it a try, and that kind of kicked me in the rear a little bit, be like, I don't have to have a genuine interest when good writers are writing good stories. But even in that, wrestling was the kind of, I don't know that how gung-ho I am to read wrestling horror. So I had a bunch of stuff on this. When I ended up getting it, yours is the last story in the book, which Bartlett's is fantastic. Pastula's actually sticks with me, even though it's very slow and subtle. Like, it's just an odd story. I don't know that I'd call it horror. It's just weird.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
But yours was the one that ended up sticking with me, and it is The Vision of James Lee Dawson, King of the Death Matches, which is a fantastic title, by the way. But by the time I got to that story and the end of it, that was when it kind of hit me. It's like, I don't care anymore what I see these books are about. You know, if I see writers that I like, I don't care anymore. I was clearly wrong to stick my nose in the air at horror wrestling.
One thing we try to do is like, they're short, right? It's 3 stories, 4 stories. So, Old Gory is two stories with a kind of a weird introduction. And so, you know, the idea is like, all right, let's find a weird theme that maybe other horror anthologies haven't come out about. Like, you know, you could do I don't want to do a Halloween anthology. Like, I feel like there's a lot of good ones out there, you know?
Yeah.
But if it's something like at the job interview one, at that time, Joe was interviewing for a bunch of jobs, and I was conducting job interviews at my work, and we were both complaining to each other about how awful the whole thing was. And we were like, you know what? Why don't we, like, what's a good horror potential for a job interview? Everyone has to do a job interview, and they suck. And so let's find a way to make them horrifying. But, like, I think if you read a book of, like, 15 job interview stories, that would be too much. But, like, 4, fine. People might give it a shot. Yeah. So I'm glad to hear you say that, because, like, you know, that's kind of what we thought, that if people don't want to, like, commit to, like, a huge 300-page book about horror wrestling, 3 stories, you know, maybe somebody will say, why not? I'll give it a shot.
Yeah, and that, I guess I never thought about it like that. That might, 3 or 4 stories is, I hear you, they always say, like when you're playing a show in music or on the stage doing theater, leave with them wanting more. I guess I never thought about, maybe it was the fact that I didn't try reading 300 pages of it, but every book that I've got done of your guys's, that's the one feeling I had. It's like, I wish there were a couple more. I could read a couple more of these. I wish there were a couple more. So it definitely works as a hook. I never thought of that, but I could have read another wrestling story or two. And the Letters of Decline, like I haven't talked about Joe's story in that very much. I know I've had Thompson on and Rab on, and I've talked about their stories, which both are fantastic. Joe's story might be my favorite one in the book, because it's weird, but not like his weird in 3 Moves of Doom. It's just out there. It's just crazy stuff happening.
I agree. I love that story. It's almost funny in parts because it's so weird, but it's also kind of uncomfortable.
Yes.
And the next Orford Parish thing is going to be a full-length collection by him. I mean, it's still going to be on the short side. It's not going to be 300 pages, but he lives in Tokyo, and he's lived there for 13 years now. Yeah, it's been a long time. So these are all stories about Tokyo and about Japan, and they're kind of like that story in Letters to Decline. They're weird, and there's some parts that are kind of funny, and then it gets really uncomfortable all of a sudden, and the whole thing is just like you feel disoriented reading it, which I love. I mean, it's just he does a completely different thing that's so unique, and I'm really excited about putting out this collection of his stories.
Yeah, and I think that's the perfect disorienting, is the perfect way to describe it. I love stuff that doesn't feel the need to explain itself. It can just be what it is, but it's rare to find that done really well, because it's easy to get lost in the nonsense. Like I have that streak running through a lot of the stuff I do, but I fully get lost in the nonsense every time. It's to the point I would say it's almost acceptable for what it is, because it's nonsense. A bit more of a joke to everything, but like it's really rare to find someone who can balance that, I think, in horror, because I deal a lot in nonsense, and most of the time they're supposed to be a joke, so whatever. But I've read a lot of people who, when you're doing it in horror, if you don't balance it right, it gets lost in a joke, and then it's bad trauma rather than good horror, I guess. Yeah. And his stuff. So I hadn't heard that you guys were doing that yet. So I am very much looking forward to that one now.
Yeah. To your point, I think it's better if you're going to get lost in the nonsense and just be than it is the opposite, which is a big problem in horror, is people explain things too much. Nothing ruins a horror story for me more than just almost like that Scooby-Doo ending where they're like summing everything up. They're like, that's why this happened, and that's what this was. And you're like, oh my God, just let it be. Let me wonder what it was. Don't tell me. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's what Bartlett's really good at it too. Bartlett is really good at it when you can.
Yes.
And it in the end, it all depends on what tone you're going for. But when you can find that perfect line between making just crazy stuff just happen, but not so much that you start laughing at it. You get that genuine disorienting feeling, and it's hard to do with word. I think I've seen a lot of movies where people do it well, but I think it's a lot easier to do just with visuals, to give it that kind of visual but only using words. I've always found that incredibly impressive.
Yeah, I agree, and Joe does it very well. So the collection should be out first half of this year, and I hope you like it. I think it's going to be really good. I've read most of the stories, and I've edited them. 1 or 2 things we have to do before we can start getting into production, and then we'll unleash it on the world.
Well, I look forward to it, and I guess we ended up talking quite a bit about Joe too, so we've covered the second half of Orford Parish. But as far as you, we know that you got the collection of Joe's stories coming out in Orford Parish. Do you guys have any other plans? And in particular, do you have anything else coming out? I know you said you had stuff in other anthologies. All I've found of your stuff is the Orford Parish stuff. So if you have anything showing up or that has recently showed up in the last year in anthologies that you want to plug, I'm listening because I would like to read them as well.
I think the most recent thing was a collaboration I did with Matt Bartlett, actually, a story that was in a magazine called Strange Eons.
I completely forgot to mention that. I got mine in the mail. They sent it to me, and it never showed up, and they had to resend it. I just got it like 2 weeks ago.
It's a really nice-looking magazine.
Yeah, it really is. I haven't had the chance to read your story, but that's like top of my list.
We were super excited to get into it because it's a great magazine, and it's something I had read before, and so to see like, my name in the magazine is a great feeling. And that's a kind of a, Matt Bartlett has Leeds, and this sort of combines a little bit of Leeds with Benedict, Connecticut, the fictional town that Joe came up with for Old Gory. So we expand on Benedict a little bit. And the second half of the year, I will have a collection of my stuff out. This will collect all the stories that I've had in various anthologies and things over the last few years, plus some new stuff. Some new Orford Parish stuff will be in it. And some of the stories are not Orford Parish related. Like there's a story about Gigi Allen in it. There was an anthology of Gigi Allen stories, and so I had to submit a story to that.
Yeah.
So that'll be coming out second half of the year, and then who knows? I do a lot of Orford Parish stuff online. Like there's a Twitter account that's supposedly from the Orford Parish Historical Society, and I've been writing like a project that might be online or might be in a book or might be both. But I don't want to say too much because whenever I explain something that I'm in the middle of, like it's like I just lose the will to do it. Like I've already talked about it.
And now you're tied to it, yeah. Oh, and I did follow Orford Parish Historical Society on Twitter. I was not a Twitter person, but then Rab opened up that Kodo Twitter account.
Yes.
And I was like, you son of a bitch. All right. So I'm on Twitter and I'm following Miskatonic Musings, Orford Parish Historical Societies, Muzzleland Press, and Sheriff Kodo, and I think Muzzleland Press follows me, and that's the entirety of my Twitter.
That's the right way to do it, honestly. Like, you just get sucked in otherwise.
Yeah. But, okay, well, and that's all what's coming up. We won't plug any of those anthologies that your stories have shown up in. That way people have to buy your book when it comes out.
That's right.
I'm really looking forward to that. And it's been fantastic talking to you. I thank you for showing up on the show today.
Well, thank you for having me. This was great, and hopefully we get to meet in person soon.
Yeah, I meant to make it to Necronomicon this last year, but I was just entering my way into financial, somewhat secure, lower middle class adulthood, and it was about 3 months too early, so I didn't have the money.
Yeah, I hear you.
I at least plan on making it, 2 years from now, whatever it is again. So hopefully we do get to meet in person. And any places on the online world that you want to plug that people can go find your stuff, find where you're at, and find Orford Parish?
I guess the best places to go, the Orford Parish Historical Society Twitter account is @OPHistory. And on Facebook, there's the Orford Parish Downtown Improvement District, which was inspired by a real Facebook page by this a town in upstate New York that it was supposed to be like a booster kind of thing, like, oh, the great stuff about our town, and like every post was like this depressing, like the store closed today. Yeah. Look at all this trash. Look at this graffiti. So I just fell in love with that and created an Orford Parish version. And yeah. There's also Orford Parish Books also has a Facebook page that we occasionally post snide juvenile comments to.
Well, and there everyone goes. I recommend going and finding Orford Parish and picking up anything with Tom Breen's name on it, because as far as I can tell, it's always fantastic. So this has been the Reading Rainbow of Death with Tom Breen.